right, so I think we're going to begin. My name is Noam Cranen. I'm with American University's Project on Civil Discourse. Our director, Professor Lara Schwartz, is here. And today we are going to have a panel discussion on political discourse and the American Jewish identity in 2019. If I could briefly introduce our panelists. First we have Aaron Keyak. He is an experienced publicist and leader in fighting for both the progressive and pro-Israel communities in political campaigns as well as Capitol Hill. He is a contributor to The Hill. He previously served as communications director for Representative Jerry Nadler of New York, a leading pro-Israel progressive who represented the highest percentage of Jewish Americans in the United States. Immediately following President Obama's re-election in 2012, Aaron became the interim executive director for the National Jewish Democratic Council, NJDC. During the election, he headed the Campaign Media Hub, a rapid response research and media outreach team that promoted President Obama's message around foreign policy issues and to the Jewish community. Prior to leading the Hub, he served as communications director and top Middle East advisor for former Representative Steve Rothman of New Jersey, also serving as the Congressman's on the Congressman's campaign. When he started with Congressman Rothman, Aaron was the youngest communications director on Capitol Hill. During the 2008 election and for the first year of President Obama's term, Aaron led NJDC's press operations. While he was at NJDC, The Hill recognized him as one of the top political pundits on Twitter, and JTA named him a leader in steering conversations about Jewish life on Twitter. Aaron got his professional start in Washington as an associate at Rabinowitz Dorf Communications, and he received his bachelor's degree with honors from Washington University in St. Louis, and is a Truman National Security Project scholar. Next. We have Dr. Lauren Strauss. She is a scholar in residence and director of undergraduate studies in the Jewish Studies program at American University here in Washington, D.C. Her courses include surveys of modern Jewish history and literature, ancient and medieval Jewish civilization, Holocaust literature and art, modern Israel, Jews in American popular culture, gender and sexuality in modern Jewish life, and Jews and the American political tradition. She speaks all around the DC area, giving public lectures, adult education courses, and serving as a commentator at Jewish cultural events. Strauss was historian and curator for a major museum exhibition on the history of the State of Israel, which opened in September 2018, and is a senior historical consultant for the new Capitol Jewish Museum, scheduled to open in DC in 2021. Strauss co-edited Mediating Modernity, Challenges and Trends in the Jewish Encounter with the Modern World. Her forthcoming book is Painting the Town Red, Jewish Visual Artists, Yiddish Culture, and Radical Politics in Interwar New York. And finally, we have Jason Benkendorf, who has served as the executive director of the American University Hillel since 2011. Under his leadership, Hillel has more than tripled student involvement and launched a wide range of initiatives to engage, educate, and empower Jewish students. In addition to his work at AU, he currently serves as the chair of Hillel International's Directors Cabinet. Prior to his work with Hillel, Jason founded and led the Mid-Atlantic region of the Curriculum Initiative, TCI, an organization that facilitated inclusive Jewish programming in independent high schools. He also served as senior officer of public and academic affairs at the Embassy of Israel, during which time he worked closely with students at AU and other DC area campuses. Jason has been involved in BBYO in a variety of capacities over the last 20 years. Passion for public service brought Jason to DC, and he received his BA in political science from AU School of Public Affairs, and he subsequently completed an MBA at Johns Hopkins University with a concentration in organization development. Jason is a devoted Washington Nationals fan, a summer camp enthusiast, and a lover of flip-flops. Congratulations on the Nats.
Well, your flip-flops.
It's a little cold for flip-flops even for me.
So just to give a little bit of context to what we are going to be talking about today, basically we're going to have what amounts to a two-pronged discussion, partly about the sort of tension between marginalization and privilege within the American Jewish community, and how we sort of understand that as American Jews and the identity of the American Jew, as well as the use of Jews and anti-Semitism as sort of a political hacky sack on both the political right and left in the United States. So I want to begin by giving each of the panelists a chance to start their remarks by discussing how a pretty big and broad question, which is how you understand the sort of contemporary American Jewish identity in the context of a marginalized identity, a dominant and powerful one, privileged one. Does it depend on the circumstances? We often sort of categorize large groups of people in sort of binary terms of marginalized versus privileged. Where does the American Jewish identity, and I know it is diverse and not a monolith, fall on that spectrum in your minds? How would you sort of describe that context? Anyone can begin. I'll start with Dr. Strauss because she's smiling and making faces.
I will teach you.
Right. You know, it doesn't help that I'm wearing orange and have the most hair on the panel. Sorry, Jason. Is this on? Does it need to be on?
It's working. We have it's going.
Okay. There you go. This is not an easy question. I think that the simplest way of answering this question is that American Jews have always had, continue to have, a certain image of themselves, whether or not the facts support the type of person they think of themselves as. So, and that has changed. The dimensions of that have changed over the years, but there remains a certain self-conception, certainly since the early 20th century, of American Jews as underprivileged, if not economically, certainly politically. There is a great awareness of their own minority status in terms of numbers, in terms of access, and along with that, there has been, for better or for worse, usually for better, in my opinion, a great sympathy with other peoples who have a similar minority status and similar problems with access. And that affiliation, those sympathies, tend to remain with the majority of American Jews, even with the changing circumstances, and we'll get into the numbers, et cetera, but even with changes over the years, that self-conception and those sympathies tend to endure within the American Jewish community. And the one caveat to that is that that's a sort of a gross generalization. When you get into the details of what it means to be sympathetic to a minority status and their positions on specific issues, those have changed a little bit over the years. So whereas there is still this general self-image of sort of being one with people who are perhaps victims of racism, et cetera, when you get into the specifics of what it then means to support those communities in this country, for instance, do you support affirmative action programs? What's your feeling about sort of the incarceration system, et cetera? Then that sort of gets to be a little bit more messy, when you're talking about specific support for programs. But overall, the self-conception of American Jews and their identity, certainly politically and also culturally, tends to be pretty similar in a general sense, really for the last 100 years.
Yeah, so I think it does depend on the circumstances, right? I mean, if you talked about somebody who, let's say, a poor woman versus a wealthy, white, cisgendered male, and they both happen to be Jewish, there's different levels of privilege there. I mean, there's no question about that, not to mention someone who wasn't white. I think from talking about the Jewish people, I'm not going to get too much into history, but just recent history. You have the Holocaust, which was an attempt to destroy the Jewish people in the most violent way possible. And then more recently, we see things like the march in Charlottesville, where the Jews will not replace us. And what's so insidious about the type of anti-Semitism we're now seeing more public in America today, is the Jews will not replace us. It's kind of a confusing phrase, right? What does that mean? Right? I'm not going to go in and be a tiki marcher in a white supremacist rally. It's just not like I'm going to go replace that one individual marcher. What they mean by that is because of their racism, for people who aren't white, basically, because their ideology is infused with this racism that they think is real, that these other races are inferior, right? I mean, that's part of being a racist, right? So there must be somebody behind these people who don't come off as white, and that's the Jew. And so the idea is the Jew is the puppet master in their ridiculous ideology that is manipulating the people who aren't white to overthrow them in a sense. And so what they mean by Jews will not replace us is the Jew as the puppet master is not going to manipulate these these what they consider lower races to overthrow the master race. What's so amazing about that is we see this in our streets now. I mean, it used to be people would have their more quiet racism, especially when it came to anti-Semitism. You'd see it occasionally. You'd see it on the far corners of the internet. You'd see David Duke. But now you see it in mainstream society, and you see them given cover by some of the highest levels of our government and their supporters. And so it does become a real threat. I would say, I would defer to the expert on the panel here when it comes to history, but I would say that, for the past, since the Holocaust, mostly, especially in America, Jews felt relatively safe. But what we see now is with this proud public anti-Semitism, now actually leading to violence, where Jews are targeted for being Jewish and are murdered. You have to relook at what it means to say that Jews are privileged. When there are obviously gradations of privilege, but now every Jew, when they walk into their synagogue or their temple or wherever their place of worship is on a high holiday, they either have to walk past a security guard or wish that there was a security guard. And then, when we're praying, we have to, we look at the exit signs. We look at what are we going to do when, God forbid, someone comes through the door? What are we going to do with our daughter or whatever? And, there's a certain amount of privilege, I think, over at least the last few years that we've lost, unfortunately.
So I think we all recognize there's a reality that there are Jewish experiences in this country of marginalization and experiences of privilege that Jews have. I think the perception that many American Jews have is that the experiences of marginalization are enduring, that at different points in time they may vary in frequency or intensity, but that experience of Jewish marginalization is an enduring experience, and that the relative privilege that American Jews experience today may or may not be so enduring. So I think it's, as my colleagues here have shared, in recent decades, it's been a pretty good time to be a Jew in America compared to almost any place in the world at almost any point in history. And yet, I think that many Jews live with fear that may not continue to be the case in the decades or centuries to come. So the privilege that we experience, which is, in my view, not necessarily a privilege that derives from Jewishness, but rather a privilege that derives from whiteness or perceived whiteness, that privilege is contingent upon the society viewing us as part of the white mainstream. That's a relatively new phenomenon, as I understand the history, and it's not necessarily something that will forever be the case. We can look back at times in the past when Jews have also experienced relative privilege, relative acceptance, and seen that deteriorate or disappear entirely. So I recognize that the point that I'm making sometimes sounds to people like a crazy idea, right? How do you go backwards like that? But I think for many Jews and for the Jewish collective in America, there is a deep fear that the privilege that we have experienced by virtue of our perceived whiteness in America is truly contingent. It's conditional, that it maybe is already diminishing to some extent, something we can talk about further. I think there are different ideas about that, but that it isn't something that can be taken for granted. And I'll just share one quick anecdote. I had the privilege a few years ago to bring a group of Jewish students from AU down to do volunteer work in the Mississippi Delta in a community that was entirely black. And there was some racial diversity in the group of students we brought, but most were Ashkenazi Jews who think of themselves or would be seen by other people generally as being white. And here we are, a group of AU Jewish folks, a bunch of Mississippians, all African American. One of our students referred to herself as white, and this group of black Mississippians all started laughing. To them, the notion that a Jew would be white was fundamentally laughable. And it started this amazing conversation that in the eyes of this community, Jews weren't certainly black, they weren't white, they were something in the middle. And it was this eye-opening moment for our students to think, it's interesting, my lived experience has made me think of myself as white, but is that always the case, or is that a result of where I am at any given moment? And I think that becomes a big question for us in this context.
That is common.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And also, I appreciate the distinction between, this idea of Jewish privilege, which can actually be a sort of trope, as I understand it, for anti-Semitic, propagation, but all with the white privilege or perceived white privilege that comes along with Ashkenazi Jews in America. And I also want to point out, obviously, that is not all Jews in America are white, and that not all Jews in America have a socioeconomic privilege as well. There are lots of different ways in which privilege manifests itself. But I wonder what you all think about what that means for American Jews thinking about their identity in the context of other groups, particularly marginalized groups, in the political context. And what I mean by that is, how do American Jews group themselves, identify themselves relative to other marginalized groups when having conversations or discussing with them or attempting to allyship with them? Do they designate themselves as fellow marginalized individuals? Do they designate themselves as people coming from a position of privilege to be an ally and to utilize that privilege? I think that can be hard for some Jews who are trying to potentially work on progressive causes, things of that nature, to try to figure out where exactly they stand within the sort of, again, the spectrum of the sort of hegemonic identity in the United States versus the marginalized identity, and how they can use that identity to then, for the greater good, particularly for the most vulnerable communities. So
You're assuming they want to work toward the greater good.
You're absolutely right. And there's that question too.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is how far can Jews sort of skate along on their privilege as well as another without potentially seeing themselves as other. How long can Jews feel part of the dominant, potentially white class? I wonder.
One interesting thing is that Most other groups who enjoy any kind of privilege, and I think it's fascinating that first Aaron and then Jason referred to, like, didn't even entertain the thought of privilege having anything to do with money or professional position. You immediately went to privilege as being some kind of security. Political and physical security. So that's interesting. What other groups that enjoy any kind of privilege constantly ask themselves whether it's legitimate for them to just, sort of sit back and enjoy it without having some sort of, feeling that of some sort of compulsion that they have to use that for the greater good, as you were saying. And, and I asked you somewhat facetiously, why assume that they do feel that way? But still, the majority of American Jews, even today, do feel that they have to either donate financially or put in hours, and that is a continuance. I think that we've had some recent developments that have changed a very long time self-image. At the beginning, really only at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, a certain different kind of Jew, and I'll explain what I mean by that, had the sense, one of the senses that you're describing, Noam, of this sort of noblesse oblige, of helping because one is in a superior position, and going and helping the less fortunate sort of image. And those people who felt that way were generally very well-connected, mostly Jews of German heritage from Germany, from Central Europe, Germany and Austria, who had come in the latter part of the 19th century and were still really dominant in running the American Jewish community and all of its institutions, creating its institutions at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And we still have some of the institutions that were created, American Jewish Committee, some of the rabbinical schools, and publication societies, charities, etc. HIAS, for instance. But that sort of model prevailed only really until the 1920s. And so those were the Jews who, for instance, helped to create the NAACP. And also the Julius Rosenwald, the founder of Sears Roebuck, also a German Jew, going in and building, there's an excellent documentary about this by Viva Kempner, building a series of schools for African Americans, et cetera. So that was this kind of helping from the top. But really, ever since the 1920s, with this vast, overwhelming influx of Jews mostly from Eastern Europe, it really changed the tenor of not only the American Jewish community, but all of American life, I would argue, but that's subject for another time. And that brought with it more of a sense of solidarity, of it not, we are here, we are taking care of you because it's the right thing to do, but we are taking care of you and us at the same time because we are all on the bottom rung, we are all workers, we all have suffered under oppression. The Jews from Eastern Europe suffering under mostly the Tsarist regime, also from Austro-Hungary, and identifying, and actually the people I'm writing one of my books about, these artists, identified outwardly as victims of pogroms with racial violence in the South. So it switched from this sort of help from the top to really a sense of solidarity. We are a minority, a persecuted minority, and they even called when they met black people for the first time, they called some of them blacks, they called them the Jews of, they called blacks, yes, the Jews of the South. And so there was this sense of solidarity through the 30s, through even the 40s, when the American Jewish community was, when its socioeconomic profile was rising, and even into the 50s, when there was some discomfort and worry in the American Jewish community about being perceived as communists, et cetera, of course, in the McCarthy era, for good reason. And that really lasted into the formation of the social welfare groups of the 70s and 80s, things like Mazon, et cetera. Just recently, that has started to change. And I'm not saying that it's gone back to a sense of noblesse oblige. What I'm saying is that in especially a younger generation, there's a sense, there's a feeling of guilt. Not, oh, we should be doing this out of guilt, but guilt that they are doing it because they're afraid suddenly, and I think this is more a function of a younger generation, a sense of, worrying that they are now suddenly going to be perceived as helping from above, and that their aid and all of their social action is suddenly going to be perceived as, or maybe is, although I don't think it is, or maybe is a sign not of solidarity, but of a certain kind of superiority. And so there is this kind of inner dialogue and this conversation that I think we only hear recently, and especially on college campuses and among millennials and in certain marches and things like that, where it's almost like a certain segment of especially the young progressive Jewish community is sort of second guessing its own reasons for doing this, and kind of, browbeating themselves for their involvement and saying, I'm doing this, but I'm not good enough. I'm not doing it for the right reasons. I'm not acknowledging my privilege enough, while I'm doing this. So I think it's a really interesting, that's sort of the first significant shift that we've seen since the 1920s.
I'll say here on campus, I've heard many times from Jewish students, Ashkenazi Jewish students who pass as white, or might identify as white, say things like, I want to be involved in conversations and work around racial justice. I walk in the door and I'm there as a Jew, but I'm seen by the people in the room as white. And it's a disconnect that I'm struggling with. Right? I've heard students articulate this in all sorts of different ways, and I think it's a challenge. It's really challenging, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think two pieces are, one, that we need to be honest always about the complexity and the duality of the experiences of privilege and marginalization, and that if those Jews who want to engage on issues of social justice go into a space and don't acknowledge that their experience is a mix of those things, that it's not going to work. And I think the other really important piece is simply to be in relationship, that as Jews, we cannot expect to go into a space with people who are not Jewish and expect them to understand the complicated ways in which being Jewish shapes our worldviews, our values, our political engagement. We just can't expect people to get that without talking to them about it, because how could they? Why would they, right? No more than I can understand the experience of a dreamer without hearing from people who have lived that experience, right? And the only way you get there is really by being in relationship, by spending real time building real relationships. And I think the fact of the matter is, as much as I wish it might be different, an Ashkenazi Jew is not going to walk into a Black Lives Matter venue and in that first moment be understood in all of their complexity. That's just not going to happen. We've got, for those of us who care about being in those spaces and doing that work, we've got to be willing to say, we're here long enough to build relationships to be able to share those pieces of ourselves that go beyond just the perception of whiteness.
Right, I'll just say one thing, because it's sort of interesting that Israel has not come up at all, not to be on a college campus and bring up the subject proactively, but I was born and raised in San Francisco, and we didn't have the word intersectionality. The concept didn't exist. But I remember when I was I was sort of undecided on the Iraq War I mean, now I am, but then I was undecided. And so I remember walking down to downtown San Francisco and to go to the protesters. I tended to be anti-war, as good people often are. And I wanted to see what their argument was. I was like, look, these are my people, let's go. And so I just walked downtown and, very anti-Bush, very anti-Iraq war. So I was feeling it. And then all of a sudden I saw these anti-Israel posters, and I saw this, bloods on your hands, and these, somewhat anti-Semitic posters. And I remember thinking at the time, I was walking there, and I'm like, listen, I remember thinking, what is this doing here? This is an anti-Iraq war protest, and you're talking about the occupation. And I was just like, listen, just leave your anti-occupation posters at home for the next march, for the next protest. But, fast forward to today, and, intersectionality is a real thing, especially, I imagine, on college campuses. And what's happened is these, I've seen in progressive spaces that Jews are excluded. And you can say, oh, well, I'll have JVP and anti-Zionist Jews. But the fact is, when 95%, I see you have Gallup right here, or you have Pew. So Gallup, they polled it, 95% of Jews identify as pro-Israel, right? Or sympathetic to Israel. And when you have a population where 95% of the people are one thing, and then you bring up 5% of the population to represent the entire group, that's tokenism. And we see tokenism all the time. I'm not going to get partisan, but you can imagine we see tokenism all the time, and we have to call that out too. And so I think what's unfortunate about our at least perceived privilege, and to some extent real privilege, is that as Jewish progressives, and we're overwhelmingly progressive, go into these spaces, we're actively excluded, or we have to hide part of our identity.
We're overwhelmingly democratic, but not necessarily progressive anymore. Now that that's, and now that there's this division, right?
So Aaron has beat me to it by a step. It's a really great point. Jason emailed me the article the other day. It's been going around a lot of the Jewish community. This op-ed written in the New York Times by a student at GW expressing their feeling about what it is like to be a progressive on a college campus who's a Zionist, and like what it means to be excluded from progressive causes like labor causes, for example, as a Zionist. And you mentioned these really interesting statistics about the level of pro-Israel sentiment within the Jewish community, as well as the level of at least democratic affiliation within the Jewish community. And so I wonder what you think, how Jews in situations like these should sort of, what is the effective way to communicate both with the progressive community as well as the as well as other communities, because one of the things that this discussion is about sort of tokenism, as you brought it up, of Jews on both the left and right. So we see what appears to be some tokenism on the far left with certain anti-Zionist organizations, as well as interesting, at least exploitation, I would argue, of anti-Semitism on the far right, clearly. So I'll ask on a broader level later, but on an individual level, and this may not be a question that's really answerable, how do Jews settle themselves within communities that are fractured in their views of what Jews really believe? This idea that Trump even brought up recently of dual loyalty. What should a young Jew on a college campus, not necessarily how do they solve the problem, but how do they think about themselves within that situation? Jason, I'm going to pick on you since you work the most with young students.
I wish I had a perfect answer, and I don't. That'd be great if somebody has one, please share it with me so I can pass it along to students I encounter. I think one helpful thought process, and it sounds very simple, but when we're in the heat of the moment, we sometimes forget this step, is to pause and say, okay, if I switched out Jewish and stuck in any other identity, would what I encountered or the situation that I'm hearing about be something we would accept or no, right? Heard about a situation not long ago here on campus where a Jewish student showed up at a progressive organizing space and somebody singled her out and said flatly, you're Jewish, what are your Israel politics? We want to know if you belong here or not, that bluntly, right? I think for some of us on a gut level, that's problematic. But for somebody who's not sure how problematic that is, let's switch out, right? There's any number of, would it be objectionable if a Muslim student were put on the spot to answer for or describe their approach to, the policies of Saudi Arabia? I think instinctively we would all recognize that's ludicrous, right? You could come up with any number of parallels. I think that we need to be willing to, first of all, think that through and say, is this something that I would recognize as problematic as it related to somebody else's identity? And if so, need to be willing to help others understand that as well and be willing to point that out. I think that there are encounters, certainly on campus, that students have around Jewish identity that would almost universally be rejected, certainly here at AU, if it related to other identity groups, and I think we need to be willing to name that. And not in an accusatory way, not in a confrontational way, but to help people understand that their approach to Jewish identity sometimes is, because of Israel politics, because of whatever it may be, out of line with their approach to all sorts of other forms of identity in a way that is deeply problematic. And I'll add just one last thought, which is to say, I don't have to be a racist to have internalized racist ideas, right? I think, in fact, it would be quite difficult to grow up in the United States looking the way that I look and not having internalized some racist ideas. And I'd like to think that I'm still in a lifelong process of identifying and eradicating those ideas. Similarly, there are lots of people who I don't think any of us would want to be in the business of calling anti-Semitic, who may have internalized some deeply problematic ideas about Jews and Jewish identity, right? Doesn't make them evil, doesn't make them anti-Semites, but it does mean that we can actually play a role sometimes in helping them to identify and hopefully eradicate some of those problematic ideas they may have absorbed, because we live in a world and in a country where problematic ideas exist around people of color and Jews and homosexuals and all sorts of other groups, and we want to be part of a process for ourselves and for those in our communities of moving beyond those wrong ideas that we've internalized often without our even realizing.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on this, or?
Yeah, I've seen a shift really, really recently, and it's actually very, very much in concert with what Jason is saying about, you didn't use these words, but calling people out, making them realize what they're doing and how it's different in their treatment of Jews, perhaps, than it would be of anyone else in the same situation. One might use the word hypocrisy. So I've really, this has really bothered me a lot, and as I mentioned before, a lot of what bothers me actually is the internalization of this sense of guilt at being Jewish by a lot of progressive Jews, especially young progressive Jews, and this worry that you've inherently, automatically done something wrong by being who you are, and feeling the need to apologize. And I think that, and I think that shouldn't be. Yes, if you are perceived as white in this country, this deeply racist country, that is an advantage in many venues, and it's good that people are realizing that for the last few years, more than they ever have before. But that should go for anyone who is white or looks white or however you want to say it, not just Jews. But in terms of the knee-jerk reaction of many Jews, especially in progressive and liberal groups, to self-doubt and also to allow themselves to be browbeaten by these kinds of encounters. I see that we still have a very long way to go, but I see incremental change really only in the past year. And I would single out as one landmark encounter that started that shift was the pushback earlier, at the beginning, very beginning of 2019, against the anti-Semitism of the Women's March. And I would point to that as really a game changer in the sense that Jewish feminists, and also with the Dyke March, the same thing of keeping Jewish, self-described Jewish dykes carrying rainbow flags with a Magen David, often called a Jewish star in the middle, keeping with the organizers of that march, trying to keep them out. With those two experiences led members of the Jewish community, of the feminist, the women's community, and the lesbian community, and also the organized Jewish community, particularly the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council. And full disclosure, one of my best friends is one of the ones who did this, who led this effort. And it caused them to say, wait, no further. You can't keep us out. You can't automatically assume that we are guilty, that we are responsible for all injustices against people of color, against Palestinians, whatever. And even if we were saying that, for instance, we agree with everything that the Netanyahu government does in Israel, which frankly most of the people who were there probably do not. That's irrelevant to our identity as feminists, for instance. So it's kind of like what Jason is saying, and also what Aaron was saying earlier about, and I had the same reaction with the Iraq War. I think Cindy Sheehan, right? She was the one who brought to the anti-Iraq rallies this automatic anti-Israel vibe, saying, leave that part home. Don't erase that part. If you have a problem with that, then when we're in a conversation about that issue, then argue with me about that. But don't tell me that I am not a feminist if I'm a Zionist. Or even if I would say I agree with Netanyahu and all his policies. That still is not relevant. And this is, I guess, anti-intersectionality. Because the current definition of intersectionality, and I actually don't think that being intersectional was initially meant to be this way, but the sort of prevailing definition now is that you have to buy into a certain list of positions on every conflict in the world, and that if you don't check off every box, then you can't come to our rally. And I think that finally, really just this year, it's the women, it's the feminists who it started with, because they said, look, there is no sugarcoating, for instance, cozying up to Farrakhan. There are no two ways about it. Farrakhan, there's just no way that you can present anything that he said in his long and very public career about the Jews as anything but just the most vile anti-Semitism. So the women who wanted to either participate in the Women's March on their own terms or call out the original organizers wouldn't back down. And at first, many forces tried to make them, and they refused to do it. And I think that it's a slow process, but I think that people have had a little bit more courage in the environmental movement, saying, yes, I can march as an Israeli environmentalist and show that I care about climate change and that it has nothing to do with my position on where the green line, should be. It is very incremental, but the only way to do it is, again, to quote my friend who was involved in the Women's March. She said, you know what? They're not going to like you anymore if you don't stand up for yourself. And I think that that's something that especially young Jews and everybody who are involved in especially progressive arenas, and we haven't even talked about the conservative arena yet, need to remember. They need to remember that they're going to walk into this room and they are who they are, and they shouldn't apologize for it. There are things that they should apologize for, that we should all apologize for. Okay, but it's not necessarily that. And that they need to be very clear about what is being discussed at that particular rally in that particular space. And as Jason said, ask people to substitute Jew for anything else.
Yeah, and let me just say something real quick, because I was thinking the same exact thing on the Women's March, and especially the Dyke March. The Women's March took longer to materialize, but for the Washington Dyke March specifically, I remember being very pessimistic going in. I had friends, like probably some of the same friends you have, who were going to that march to march as feminists, Zionists, self-identified dykes, with their Magen David flags, which were explicitly prohibited. And I wasn't there, but I watched this take place over live stream. And I remember thinking, the organizers of the Dyke March, especially in Washington, they knew this was coming. I mean, this was not some surprise. And they chose to actively exclude proud public Zionists, or at least signs of Zionism, right? And so this was going to be a fruitless enterprise, that's what I thought, because these leaders must have understood what they were doing, and then, just like if you didn't identify as a dyke, you weren't a full participant. Also, Zionism was part of that identity of oppression, and there's this also, I don't have to explain to you, but there's the idea of being your full, authentic self. And there are these wonderful feminists and self-identified dykes who went and challenged them with the Magen David flags. Rainbow flags, right? And just to call out one specific person, because you should read what she writes. Carly Pildes was there, and she wrote about this at length in Tablet.
She's a good writer.
Yeah, she's great. Yeah, and in a way, she's very optimistic, because she thinks we can be part of those spaces. And maybe not as full participants, depending on the march or whatever, but at least as allies. And if you watch the video that comes out of that event, so first they engage, and they say the things you would normally say. I deal with this all the time in the Republican-Democratic debates. I basically don't talk to Republicans about, abortion, for example, because I know where they're at. We're not going to change our minds, right? You say what you're going to say, and then there's no compromise. But what we saw over that period of time is that actually the leaders of the Dyke March changed their minds, with some concessions on both sides. But these self-identified Jewish Zionist dykes were actually able to participate in an event that they were excluded from only, an hour before. And so, and then we saw with the Women's March over a much longer period of time. But if you do push back, if people are being honest about their ideals, I was wrong. There actually is a chance that some of us can participate in those marches. And I remember talking to Carly about it afterwards, and she's like, "Listen, Aaron, I just told them who I am and how we want to stand there, shoulder to shoulder, either as dykes or as allies, and fight for the same justice that we're all fighting for. And that part of her authentic self is to be a Zionist, and we should engage in dialogue with Palestinians." And something we never see in Washington, their minds were changed, and they were able to participate.
But they felt threatened.
Oh, for sure.
They felt threatened, and they actually had people walk with them to protect them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that. And Aaron, I'll start with you on this one because it's a little bit policy related, or at least politically, which is that we are seeing, obviously growing polarization in both parties, and we are seeing moves in both parties to, at least relatively to their respective extremes, moving further to the left within the Democratic Party and moving further to the right within the Republican Party. And one interesting thing that we have been seeing more and more of, or at least I have experienced there being more and more of, is this sort of tossing around by both parties of labeling the other party anti-Semitic or pushing anti-Semitic ideas. We saw this from Republicans with the Squad, and particularly with Representative Omar and her comments. And then we also saw this from the Democrats particularly after Tree of Life, arguing that the rhetoric of Donald Trump contributed to the ideologies that led to that. How do Jews reclaim anti-Semitism within the sort of political realm in this way, where it sort of seems to become a co-opted by the political parties as a sort of tool to attack the other one? How do Jews themselves sort of take that back?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the progressive community, we allow in the progressive community, marginalized groups to find the hatred against themselves, right? You're not gonna, as a white person or as a straight person, you're not gonna go to the African American community and say, oh no, don't be worried, that's not racism. Or no, I know you don't feel safe, in this synagogue because of the things that the rabbi says when it comes to same-sex marriage. But you don't get to define what being homophobic or being transphobic is. I mean, imagine saying that to somebody. I know you feel threatened. I know you feel that this is hatred is against you. But you don't, that's not actually genuine. That's not an actual genuine attack on you, even when it is. So Jews also, just like other groups, we must be able to define the hatred against us. We must be able, if we feel threatened or we see anti-Semitism, and the Jewish community says that it's anti-Semitism, that's anti-Semitism. Someone who's not Jewish is not going to come and define hatred of Jews against us. We know what we feel, we know what we see. We also have a long history of encountering anti-Semitism over thousands of years, and when we see it. And I want to root my comments in data so as not to just be partisan, but if you poll the Jewish community, something like 76, 75% of Jews in the U.S. disapprove of how Trump's handling the issue of anti-Semitism. When Trump gets up the day after the Charlottesville marches and said there were fine people on both sides, when there were literally Nazis on one of the sides, we see what that is, right? And so there's this sort of sense, unfortunately now, that anti-Semitism is an issue. I've done lots of campaigns, especially going after the Jewish vote. And previous to this past presidential campaign, as a domestic issue, anti-Semitism didn't come up in the political discourse, not really. Certainly we wouldn't do ads on it. And, I'm a Democrat trying to convince Jewish voters to vote Democrat, and it just was not part of the messaging. And yet, what we saw with Trump's closing video of his campaign, his last effort, remember, he didn't think he was going to win. His campaign didn't think he was going to win. This was his best shot. He was going all in. And what does he do? He produces a video with barely veiled anti-Semitic tropes in it, and that Jews saw very clearly for what it was. And it wasn't like he was going after Jewish votes then, obviously. It's worse. He's going after American votes. He's going after the people who he thinks are persuadable. And what is the message that he and his campaign decide to do for that last argument? I mean, it's easily one of the most anti-Semitic American ads that I've ever seen. I mean, there just aren't that many, at least recently. So, and let me just talk about the left for a second, and then I'll yield. Because, I mean, we're not blameless either. It is true that from the right-wing version of anti-Semitism, the white supremacist version of anti-Semitism, does seem to me much more violent, at least in the United States. But there is a real danger on the left as well. You know, like 83% of Jews see BDS as anti-Semitic. You know, I think if you just read what BDS was founded on, it's basically anti-Semitic. There's an idea that, you know, if you don't allow for a nation for self-determination of Jews, it's the same thing. And so we see an embrace, especially on the palette of intersectionality, that you have to be pro-BDS, which is a problem on the left as well. And we see two members of Congress who embrace the pro-BDS platform. One of them is for a one-state solution. So the problem is on the left also, and we need to be proud Jews and proud Zionists and combat that. I would think, though, and I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that Jason and I both mentioned security as one of our first in our opening comments. And when it comes to the security of Jews in the United States, it is a right-wing problem. It's not to say it can't be a left-wing problem at some point, but it is fundamentally a right-wing problem. You're not worried about some BDS activist shooting up your synagogue with an AK-15, just AR-15. It's just not going to happen.
I don't know if I'd say that, but.
So I'll piggyback and just say, I think, I don't disagree with Aaron that at this point, the graver physical threat to Jews in the United States comes from the right. I also think it's important to name why I think there is so much mental and emotional energy spent in the Jewish world, focused on the anti-Semitism of the left. And my read is it's because that's home for most American Jews, right? The bully at school, when he picks on me, like, that's not personal. That's just who he is. That's just who Nazis are. Like, they're not people I related to in the first place. Like, so when Nazi's gonna Nazi, like, what am I gonna do about it, right? I don't mean to be dismissive. Obviously, it's, but I don't expect anything different from the fringe right. As Jews, that's just what we're used to. But as has been named, the vast majority of American Jews, and if we're setting aside the ultra-Orthodox community, just a staggering, overwhelming majority of American Jews see themselves as part of the Democratic coalition. A huge chunk would identify as progressive. So when we see anti-Semitic sentiment expressed, even if it's taking less threatening, less violent forms, psychologically, emotionally, it's just very different. It has that emotional impact of saying that place you thought was home, maybe not. So I think we just need to be honest about why. I think, we can say, yes, the physical threat is primarily from one side at this point, but that doesn't mean the impact in real terms for the community isn't really significant in terms of what we're seeing on the fringe left and moving farther and farther from the fringe, sadly. Look, I'll also just name, I think that individual Jews and the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, have sometimes been great allies to other communities in their times of need, and sometimes we've fallen short. I think that we need to be constantly evaluating and striving to be allies to those we say that we're allies to. And likewise, I think it's reasonable for us to look around and expect to see allyship. And I think that a lot of individuals and communities who had positioned themselves or dubbed themselves allies to the Jewish community have fallen tremendously short in recent years, and that needs to be acknowledged. Frankly, I'm more pleased at the moment what I'm seeing in the United Kingdom, where we're seeing some very high-profile non-Jewish public figures, writers, actors, activists stand up and be visible, vocal allies to the Jewish community in a way that I don't think we've actually seen to the degree that I would have expected and hoped for in American society in recent years, and I hope that changes at the same time that our Jewish community still has an obligation to be allies to others.
Most amazing, awesome person in the world is J.K. Rowling. If you haven't seen her statements calling out British anti-Semites, she's it. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was going to say also what Jason said, that it's true, it's personal when it's on the left, in a way that it's not on the right. And there's absolutely, there's no question from a data perspective that it's not just perception that anti-Semitism on the right is more violent. There's been almost no actual violence, certainly no murderous violence in this country coming from the left, although there have been some pretty awful threats of violence that I've seen personally. But yeah, it is, it is internalized. It's, it's also this sense of history. But we did so much for you. How could you say that now? However, it isn't just a Nazi being a Nazi, and they're going to do that to anybody. It just so happens, I said this earlier, that only a few hours ago, only about 7 hours ago, in my class on Jews and the American political tradition, I had in my class today a speaker who is one of the lawyers suing the Charlottesville organizers of the Unite the Right rally. I brought him in, and it was amazing. Ask my students. And one of the many incredible things that he brought out, which is incredibly depressing in this case, was that although the rhetoric that was repeated in the media and a lot of the people who felt that it was an affront, this rally had to do with people of color, actually almost all of sort of the slogans of the people in from all of the different disparate groups in the Unite the Right march, from the KKK to all of the different right-wing groups, they focused mostly on Jews. So, as you said before, Jews will not replace us. But their imagery, when you go to their websites, when you hear who they're blaming for things, yes, they hate people of color, but exactly as Aaron was saying before, it all goes back to the Jews. So it's not just kind of like a Nazi will be a Nazi. It is very specifically targeted at the Jews and the Jewish community. And it's not only, and as Aaron was saying, this concept of the Jew as puppet master, orchestrating the rise of the non-white population here, but it's also, and this directly relates to Pittsburgh, the Jew pushing for this country to be flooded by more non-whites, i.e. immigrants, especially immigrants of color. And the reason I say, of course, that directly relates to Pittsburgh is because the shooter in Pittsburgh named Hias, and the Jewish, refugee advocacy organization since 1880. So those are very specific, and Jews shouldn't, we shouldn't comfort ourselves by saying, oh, they hate lots of people. No, it actually is very, very specific and very targeted against the Jewish community. But I do think that there is that there are lots of silver linings, and one of the silver linings is this realization that there are many avenues to not only to education but to fighting against hate speech, hate rhetoric, and Jews. This is actually the point of this entire course that I'm teaching. Jews have often been in the vanguard of, have often really created those avenues for political action and political expression in American history, especially since the early 20th century. And whether you look at exercising your voice in terms of demonstrations, mass rallies, in terms of organizing in unions, of course, you look at the history of the labor movement, in terms of lobbying, in terms of legislative change, electoral politics, and now with this most recent example of this lawsuit, actually suing these people and holding them responsible financially and otherwise, also going through the U.S. Constitution, et cetera. So there's a lot to be scared of, and there's a lot to be upset about, but there are also a lot of tools that are being developed and being honed constantly, and and that's nothing to be ashamed of. And the other thing that I'll say is, of course, then groups, including groups that are often critical of Jews, themselves will then learn from those examples and use those same tactics a little bit afterwards, and start filing lawsuits and things like that. And they acknowledge it, actually. So it's kind of, that's the optimistic spin on these things.
Thank you so much for that. Staying with the sort of political name calling and use of, Jews and anti-Semitism, another thing that has been a source of controversy that I have found interesting is the use of terms like concentration camps to refer to the detention camps at the southern border, for example, Hitler-esque to refer to multiple people, but particularly President Trump. One thing that I am interested in your thoughts on is, it's often said that that the identity group or the community are the gatekeepers of the terms that are sort of theirs or have been used against them. I wonder what are Jews the gatekeepers of terms like Hitler-esque and concentration camp? Do we get to decide when it's out of bounds for a congresswoman to refer to detention camps as concentration camps, or to refer to the president as Hitler-esque, or is that not our prerogative? And do we have a responsibility, perhaps even to when we say things like "never again"? When do we have a responsibility to bring those terms back into the fold?
It's our prerogative, but they don't have to listen. So.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's an important question, and I also am reticent about the Jewish community putting ourselves in the position of being the language police. I don't think that that's going to be helpful to us broadly in achieving what we strive to accomplish for our community and for the nation as a whole, so I think it's something we need to be careful about. I think we also should be careful about our own use of language. I do think that there's that as Jews, we can recognize that others will take cues from how we use some of these terms. And so if we're to flip, as maybe I was a few minutes ago, in using certain terms, that signals to others that they need not necessarily take those terms as seriously. But I am nervous about the prospect of us routinely being the language police.
Yeah, but also, just unlike support for Israel, Jews are divided on the use of these terms. I mean, a lot of the people who are talking about concentration camp, Trump essentially building concentration camps were Jews themselves. So there's not a consensus in the Jewish community, I don't think, around those issues. And frankly, I think if you polled the majority of the Jews, they would call them concentration camps. So, this isn't one of those issues like sympathy for Israel, or like some of the other more consensus issues in the Jewish community where there is sort of a united voice.
Yeah. And I also wonder, I mean, you guys, you have all brought up the sort of statistics about, how many Jews support certain things like this. How do we create a Jewish identity, or allow for a Jewish identity on the individual level, for in terms of self-identifying, but also thinking about political positions, without sort of creating a Jewish narrative that is monolithic, that sort of says, like, sort of, for example, how do we understand, Jews who are in that 5%, for example? How do we sort of build connections within the Jewish community, even as we say, well, Jews, as a large majority support these things, when we're talking less about policy and more about creating a American Jewish identity with a certain level of cohesion? How do we acknowledge those differences and move past them? Because although, as you have all said, there is generally a majority of Jews agreeing on certain things, there is certainly division within the Jewish community on policy. And I wonder what you think an American Jewish identity that is beyond American politics looks like, or if such a thing could exist, at least on the individual level.
You mean still political, but not about American politics, or you mean not political? American Jewish identity that's cultural or religious? What exactly?
I suppose cultural, religious. I think it has to be beyond politics, right? Because if it is, or perhaps not. I mean, if you
That's
think
harder.
that
That's harder. There's much more consensus on politics than there is on religion. So, that's.
I like bagels.
Yeah, right. There's gastronomic Judaism. But you're being Ashkenaz-centric. Yeah, I mean, politically, it's really interesting, actually. The last few elections, the Republican-Jewish coalition, every election keeps sort of hopefully saying, like, this time, because of this, because there's this conception that, that Obama, was not a friend of Israel. And then there's this idea that, this, that, Hillary, whatever. They keep being so hopeful. And then in presidential election after presidential election, at least up to this point, Jews have generally voted, it averages out to be about 75-25. 75% voting for the Democratic presidential candidate and 25 voting for the Republican. Sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. So it's really quite fascinating. And so politically, I think there pretty much is a consensus. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Religiously, Jason brought up the ultra-Orthodox community. There is, sort of static. The other kind of outlier community politically is the former Soviet Jews, the Jews from the former Soviet Union, although that's changing a little bit generationally. And still, still there is pretty much a consensus. The Reform and conservative Jewish communities represent still the majority of American Jews who identify with a movement. And so one last thing that we're not really covering here, but just that bears mention, is the sort of the chasm between American Jews culturally, including religion, and politically when it comes to Israel. Because while there is generally consensus among American Jews that Israel should exist and that there should be a two-state solution, the exact particulars of that are not completely worked out yet. There are vast differences between American Jews and at least the politically, the religious question in Israel. And so, so when you ask what is the consensus American Jewish identity, I mean, it really depends on, it's like, what's the analogy? This is a political analogy, right? The elephant, right? With the blind men with the elephant, that their essence is like an old fable or something, asking people who are is there a PC term now for blind? I don't know, non-seeing. People, to describe the elephant, and, someone holds the trunk, and someone holds the leg, and someone holds, the tail, and so they all describe it completely differently. It depends if you're asking about American Jewish identity. Are you talking about just electoral politics? Done, 75-25 for the foreseeable future. Aaron can correct me if I'm wrong. If you're talking about Israel, gets a little more complicated, but, pro the existence of Israel, done. Pro two-state solution, mostly done. Contours of that, working it out. But if you're asking culturally, including religion, then it gets a little more complicated, especially when you start talking about the representation, or lack thereof, of the majority of American Jews and their religions in Israel. So it's a complicated question. That was a Jewish answer, by the way.
No, it's yeah, absolutely. But Aaron, also, I'm interested in understanding a little bit better why that 75-25-ish divide is so pronounced, why that has developed, if there is a reason for it. If we see an American Jewish identity that is not necessarily super cohesive in other realms, why is it relatively cohesive politically? What is that drives that in your mind, at least?
Well, it's because the Republican Party, especially under Trump, is antithetical to Jewish values. Whether you're talking about traditional Jewish values, like in the Torah or whatever, or if you're talking about polling. We talk about Israel being 95%. It's also, when you talk about reproductive rights, it's something like 9 out of 10 Jews support a woman's right to make healthcare choices with her own body. When you talk about immigration, even when there is polling on, like wealth distribution, the American Jewish community is just fundamentally center, left, and left. That's just the identity, especially when you start talking about unaffiliated Jews and Reform Jews. Now, look, if you dissect the Jewish community in certain ways, like the ultra-Orthodox, you can make divisions, but there's just no question that the vast majority of Jews are like pro-choice, pro-immigrant, pro-Israel, and generally have a more progressive or liberal democratic view on the world. Now, that is actually quite different than some of our peers in Israel. So there are a couple divides in the Jewish community globally. So it's Orthodox, really, like Jason said, the ultra-Orthodox, but Orthodox and non-Orthodox. And it's Israeli Jews and American Jews. If you look at the polling, it really is quite different. The majority of Jewish Americans are definitely two states, anti-Bibi, for example. And so for any of us who interact with Israelis on a regular basis or go to Israel, you can see that divide. But you can also see the divide of how ridiculous it is how some on the right or some white supremacists look at Jews as a monolith on Israel policy too. Any of us who've been to Tel Aviv, the idea that we're all supporting Bibi is absurd. So we could talk about why a lot. But more importantly, I think it just is, right? If you talk about what the vast majority of Jews in the United States think, they're going to pull the lever for Democrats, and they're going to have a more liberal or progressive outlook. And Matt Brooks could have his 24% of the Jewish community, but he's not.
Matt Brooks is the head of the Republican Jewish Coalition.
Right, the top Republican Jew in the country. He's not going to get more than 25%, even running against somebody like, especially with Trump.
I'll just very quickly add that I think it's important to recognize that the Jewish world has changed so much so quickly in the last 75 years. You're talking in an incredibly short period of time. The Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, the collapse of the Soviet Union with millions of Jewish residents. to talk about a unifying Jewish identity, I'm not sure the Jewish community right now knows who we are enough to get, so, and I don't know whether that pace of change will slow, but I think we just have to be cognizant of, everything that the Jewish world took as kind of the status quo has inalterably changed in a couple of generations, and so we're just like hanging on for dear life much of the time. And so I think we just need to cut ourselves a little bit of slack in terms of working towards the wonderful aspiration of a more united sense of Jewish identity.
Right, yeah. No, that's a great point. And,
Also, actually, one last thing I want to say, just to throw this out there, is that what we've been talking about is very specifically an American Jewish identity, and not only the dichotomy between America and Israel, but the profile of, for instance, a Western European Jew is not at all similar. The most similar would have been pre-Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Jew in the UK. But historically, politically, you don't have the same kind of profile of French Jews or Australian Jews supporting kind of liberal domestic causes in the same way. It's very interesting. So the American Jewish identity, if there is such a thing, there is such a thing, except it's, slippery, is a really rare animal. It's really a product of the history of this combination of being Jewish and being American, and being in this, in theory, free society, democratic ideals, et cetera. It's very...
yeah, well, I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you guys sort of got to the cruxes of this discussion. Like, is there such a thing as an American Jewish identity? That's like basically what I wanted to see if we could sneak our way into, and also like what makes the American political Jewish identity unique, and you have really touched on that, and so I really thank you. I have one final question, and I'll start with Dr. Strauss because it's a historical one, but I'd love everyone to touch on it, and then we'll wrap up, which is, where do you place this, the current otherization of Jews within American society relative to the many other historical examples of Jewish otherization? Do we see it as, I'll give an anecdotal example. My mother, for example, is a very, she has these very sort of paranoid ideas about, she's always thinking about, is this Weimar Germany? Is this Weimar Germany? Where do we put the current context of the Jewish identity within America relative to both the Jewish identity in America historically, as well as the Jewish identity in other places historically? And I'd love...
Do you mean Jewish identity, which generally comes from Jews, or treatment?
Treatment
of
treatment of the Jew.
Right. So that's more external.
Yeah, the external things.
Is what you're asking. Because identity comes from within. This is not Weimar Germany. Certainly not Nazi Germany. It is still, and I argue with my historian colleagues about this. There seems to be an allergy in the sort of American Jewish, historian community to what's generally called American exceptionalism, and to being labeled as too much of a Pollyanna and starry-eyed patriot. Well, I'm not Pollyanna, but I do still think that this is a unique environment, and that there's more potential here for positively determining the fate and outcomes of sort of the Jewish story here than in most other, really any other place in diaspora. I have changed that a little bit, or that's been tempered in the past year. And I used to say, when I heard presentations from certain people representing certain American Jewish organizations. I used to think of it as fear-mongering, because all they did, and frankly, all they still do, is stand up and spout statistics of anti-Semitic incidents and how many swastikas were drawn on desks in schools in the last month. And it is very important to collect those statistics and be aware of them. But that's sort of not what I start with. And look, I mean, Pittsburgh and everything else, really the climate has changed. It really has. And it's different than it ever was in my lifetime, in any of our lifetimes. However, I really do think that you still can't compare the situation of the American Jew to the situation of Jews anywhere in diaspora over the last 2,000 years. And that is less a function of American Jews being so gosh darn brilliant and, wonderful and whatever, and patting ourselves on the back. And it's more a function of the incredible multi-layered and pluralistic society in which we live. So two elements, really. The mosaic that is America isn't replicated anywhere. There really is nowhere else that embodies this many different peoples and cultures and languages, and that has always been a good thing for Jews throughout history. It's been better to be one of a variety. And the other, as I was talking about before when I was discussing forms of political action, is that, there is this constitution and a certain rule of law and a history and an engagement with ideals that, that's what this lawsuit that's being brought against the Charlottesville marchers that I heard about intimately today is one example of that. There really isn't any other system under which Jews have lived that equals the American system. The last thing, the note of caution is that it is only as good as we force it to be. That it's there, that we live in this pluralistic society, great. We have this amazing constitution and system, great. But it's only going to help us and preserve us if we insist on holding it up to that standard, and if we aren't shy about it.
I very much agree with Lauren, and very well put. I would say, my feeling is that a golden era for Jews in America has ended. There was a definable period of time in which Jewish life in America was vibrant and secure and flawed and challenged, but there was a remarkable period of time that coincided with America in some ways being on a bit of a break from history. I think both of those things have ended. That being said, just because a golden age has ended doesn't mean the worst case scenario has to follow. And to echo Lauren, if another golden age for diaspora Jews is to come in the foreseeable future, I agree, it will come in America if we make it so, because the circumstances here are so extraordinary and so unique, and even shy of that. I think there's no place in the diaspora where Jewish life can thrive as it does here, and where Jews can be safe in the way they are here. And I don't envision that changing, even as perhaps many of us feel a bit less secure than we have in the past.
Yeah, just real quick, I totally agree. We are not about to embark, or not to have an environment like the one that followed, like in Weimar, Germany. And I just, like Jason was saying earlier, a lot has changed for us as Jews. What happened in Germany would have been a lot different if there was a Jewish state of Israel at the time, with one of the world's most powerful air forces, reportedly with nuclear weapons.
Reportedly?
I was in Poland within the past year. They were trying to convince us that it was a good place for Jews. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was talking to the historians and the journalists and the government officials there in Poland, is that their honest main argument was that we're victims too. We were victims too, and they were. I mean, it was terrible. But the question of the Jew in Poland when it came to Nazi Germany was, in essence, a compromise with Nazi Germany. And they logically decided that they had to protect their own first, and they saw Jews as the other, not as their own, even if we're a large part of the population. The thing is, with the existence of the Jewish state of Israel, a powerful Jewish state of Israel, there's going to be no question about compromising on the safety of Jews anywhere in the world, because that is the entire reason for the existence of the Jewish state of Israel. So you're not going to have that conversation. Poland might be able to compromise on part of its population, but Israel isn't. So I do think when it comes to another, God forbid it ever even comes close again, but a historical idea of a state that wants to exterminate all Jews, you do have to deal with the military and political reality of Israel existing as a state. And we in America are nowhere close to having to factor that in yet, but it's a different situation than we saw in
It's nice to know.
in the 40s.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank everyone so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noam.
Thank you.